Good afternoon and welcome. Good morning for a few of you on the West Coast. As Richard said, the National Board Academy is a special gathering, even if it's in a totally different structure this year. So thanks for joining us. This is a large virtual community for this series of sessions that will take place at 2:30 Eastern throughout the 4 days of the Academy. And together we'll reflect on the intersection of equity in education and cultural competence. We'll be examining those important and timely issues in light of our national board documents. And that is what we call our 5 core propositions, the architecture of accomplished teaching, and the national board standards. And I want to stress that this session is open to anybody who is interested in engaging in the conversation, not that those who are just familiar with the documents that make up the core body of knowledge. At the National Board, we've been shining a spotlight on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion for years. And we believe that all students should have access to accomplished teachers. They should be taught by teachers who look like them, and that teachers should have an opportunity for the best professional development possible. The COVID-19 pandemic has helped shine a light on equity issues, Black Lives Matter movement, and the great disparities that exist in our nation's schools that were brought out by this pandemic. And I think about how deeply racial inequity has impacted my own life, and I'm proud to be in this role to lead the National Board and to be able to have an impact to help drive change for students and for their teachers and communities. These 4 sessions are being held by the National Board's network of accomplished minoritized educators. And before I turn this over to our speakers, I just want to add a little bit of clarity. The network's name includes the word minoritized. And I want you to pause and think for a minute about that word. In the US, students of color are no longer the minority, but remain minoritized. So that is too often being treated as though they don't belong or they're not equal. They're not a minority, but they're often made to feel that way or to feel less than. So we want to work together to change that reality, and let's stop doing that to each other and to anybody that we come in contact with. So I urge you to reflect on your shortcomings, because we all have those blind spots, and let's be a force that, when we examine our own interpersonal feelings and thoughts, that we don't project. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to 2 extraordinary educators, our own board member and friend, Tanya Holmes-Sutton, and a new friend, Michelle Jeanpaul, to lead the rest of today's session.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Welcome to our session today. I have the distinct honor to introduce Michelle. My name is Tanya Holmes-Sutton. I am a National Board Certified Teacher and Early Childhood Journalist. I also am a member of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, and I'm located in Las Vegas, Nevada. Michelle Jeanpaul has been a public school principal in Winnipeg, Canada for the past 12 years. She is the founder of Educators of Color Network, a grassroots organization that provides high-quality professional development and networking opportunities to primarily racialized and/or internationally trained educators. She holds a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor's in Education, and a Master's degree in Education, and she is currently working towards a PhD focusing on the role of racial bias in the hiring recommendations of school principals. I've had the honor to hear Michelle speak, and was very excited to be able to extend to her an invitation to be here with us today. And so, Michelle, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I want to
Tanya, Michelle, I'm not sure I'm hearing the audio clearly.
Oh, hello? Okay.
There you go.
There we go. I think Tanya has muted. And so before I begin, I want to start with the land acknowledgement. So I'm sitting here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. The part of the city that I'm in are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, and the Dakota people. We're part of the province of
Michelle, Michelle, we're losing you
and I
again.
respect the. Oh,
Maybe it might work better if just for the moment you turn off your video. We've
okay.
experienced that sometimes that makes the bandwidth issues a little better.
Okay. And so I acknowledge my responsibility to the treaties as both an educator and as a human being. And so this type of land acknowledgement is something that is commonplace in Canada, particularly within educational settings. But I draw upon the wisdom of one of my grade 5 students who says it's one thing to say that we acknowledge the land, and it's another thing to demonstrate that we acknowledge it through our actions. And so part of my role as an educator who strives to be an anti-bias, anti-racist educator is continually considering what my role is towards truth, reconciliation, and justice in all of the work that I do. I also want to take a moment to recognize a colleague of mine and a dear friend who passed away yesterday. And as I kind of coped with the imposter syndrome that often comes before I speak publicly or I present writing of some kind, her fierceness as an educator and her belief in others and support of other women in educational leadership is where I'm going to try to focus my energy as I move forward. So I invite you to stay engaged, which I understand can be tricky to do as we are all, living in these virtual spaces, and as opposed to being, present at a conference where many of us are likely sitting in our homes where there are many other distractions that come with the virtual environments that are becoming our way of being. I invite you to speak your truth, although you're all muted, so you'll be speaking to yourselves, but confront yourself with some honest truths about what you believe as an educator. I invite you to experience discomfort. As educators, we're often expecting our students to take risks in their learning, and so we need to model those same behaviors. And finally, I invite you to expect and accept a lack of closure. In preparation for my address today, I had to take myself out of classroom workshop mode where I try to model my pedagogical approach so that what I'm doing aligns with good practice as an educator. But I have to tell you that this won't be a make and take. You will not walk out of this session, with the 1, 2, 3 of how to be an anti-bias, anti-racist, equitable educator. But I hope at the very least it provides you with some points of reflection and ways that you can adjust your practice on a regular basis. And so I think it's always important to center ourselves in who we are. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about myself. And in research, we talk about reflexivity. And this is positioning yourself so that you're exposing the lens or bias that you bring to the interpretations of the data or the matter at hand in front of you. So the introduction spoke briefly about who I am, but I am born, raised, and have lived my entire life here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is central Canada, 2 hours north of Grand Forks, North Dakota. If you have no idea where Grand Forks is, we're about 7 hours north-ish of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so my mom is Russian Mennonite, and she moved to Canada as a child after being born in a Mennonite colony in South America. Her parents were refugees to South America, fleeing Europe due to war and religious persecution. My father is of Haitian descent. He was born and worked as a teacher in Haiti before moving to Canada as an adult and resuming his career as an educator here. And I am a proud Black woman who comes from this legacy of both persistence and resistance. And this greatly informs my work as an educator and my way of being and my way of seeing in the world. As mentioned, I just completed my 12th year as a school leader. Prior to that, I worked as a classroom teacher, and I worked largely in schools with French immersion programming. So I'm fluently bilingual in both French and English. The schools that I've worked in are very diverse settings, and I worked from everywhere from pre-kindergarten to 12th grade. I hold a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Education, a Master of Education, and I'm currently working on my PhD. And I always struggle on including those letters at the end of my name. Is that it's elite, that I've been deeply socialized within oppressive, exclusive, Eurocentric institutions. But it also speaks to the fact that I was able to navigate my way through those systems that weren't created necessarily for people from my background, people with my identity. And hopefully in the process of navigating those systems, I've been able to change them a little bit. So my city of Winnipeg. Growing up, my 4 sisters and I were often the only Black students in our classes, if not the only Black students in our schools. But I've seen a change in this predominantly white city over the last 40 years. So with a population of about 800,000, now about 11% of our population identify as Indigenous. And so when I use the word Indigenous, I'm referring to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And you'll recognize that in my land acknowledgements, I was more specific in the language that I used in recognizing the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, and the Innu people. Part of our work as equity educators is recognizing the evolution of language, of naming, and the importance of self-naming. And so our education needs to continue. And so when we were in school, perhaps the names that we used to identify different groups were different. But now that we know better, we need to do better and use the names that people give themselves. There's a misconception when we look at the history of racism in Canada, and often we ourselves look to you, our neighbors south of the border, and our own homegrown racism is absent from our education and from our education system. And so many of us Canadians are ignorant to our Canadian history of Indigenous genocide. And that continued to the reservation system that the South African government looked to in enacting apartheid. And it continued into the legacy of residential schools, where we're still seeing survivors of residential schools, and we're seeing the harmful legacy that has left between schools and the Indigenous community. In Canada, we have our own history of the enslavement of Blacks, and that while we may have emancipated people earlier, that legacy of that history remains. And we see that through the destruction and demolition of historically Black communities like Africville, Nova Scotia. And we see it in present day conversations about anti-Black racism and Google the Toronto District School Board, the Peel District School Board, where there are community groups actively working to confront racism in schools. The Japanese internment, the Chinese head tax, the examples, unfortunately, of racism in Canada go on and on and on and on. And so when a few weeks ago, 7 hours south of the border in Minneapolis, Minnesota, we witnessed the murder of George Floyd, there was suddenly this reckoning of the treatment, the mistreatment of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, not just south of the border, but here at home as well. You'll notice I use the term BIPOC, and you might have heard this term more often over the next while, and this refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I center myself in this as a Black woman, starting with Black, but I encourage those of you who are white and developing your allyship to consider centering our first people, Indigenous people, followed by Black people who were historically brought to North America through forced means of enslavement, and then finally people of color. And so with this incident of the murder of George Floyd, we are seeing people rise up in this righteous rage at how Black, Indigenous, and people of color are mistreated, excluded, and muted in our broader society. And within circles of education, we're having conversations that many of us BIPOC educators have been having for years, but this sudden awakenness, this consciousness when it comes to things like inequitable hiring, the overpunishment of Black and Indigenous youth in schools, the lack of representation in curriculum. And so that brings us to the question of so what, and now what? So in the words of Toni Morrison, I get angry about things and then I go to work. So what is our work as educators? So for myself personally, I ground my work in my experience. And that comes a lot of it from my own Afro-Caribbean community here in Winnipeg during my formative years in the 80s. And so to better understand my identity and my role in the community and my role as an educator, I started looking to members of the community. And from them, I've developed these three identities, or these three characters. The first we'll call William. So William is a community advocate. He's known for his boisterous and big personality. He's constantly in the media talking about racism in police, racism in schools, racism at all levels of government, racism in the media. He's a disruptor. Next, we have Joseph. Joseph is an educator who is involved in community and advocacy groups, as well as very involved in the education community. And Joseph is an infiltrator. And finally, we have Judith. Judith attends community dinners and celebrations, both within the cultural community and beyond. And Judith is what we'll call a survivor. So these three modes of social resistance, which now, with scholarship behind me, I can call, instead of this idea or understanding, a theoretical paradigm, were my way of making sense of my place in this world. And so William, our disruptor. Our disruptors are those who work externally to constantly challenge the system. These people are vocal, they're visible, and they're persistent in their calling out of injustice. Next, we have our infiltrators, which were characterized by Joseph. These are the people who work to challenge the system from within, and they use their presence to create space and opportunities for critical conversations with others. And then finally, we have our survivors, which are characterized by Judith. And our survivors work within systems, often subscribing to the status quo without any real overt or obvious challenges to it. And so these three identities exist along a spectrum. The function of the institution, of school, other institutions, is to recreate society. And society is largely inequitable. And so these identities aren't absolute, and any person can find themselves at any space along the spectrum at different times, either consciously or unconsciously. And the point that I want to explore with you today is the importance of understanding that all three of these identities are valid forms of resistance. So moving forward, let's talk about each of these three categories. And so first are disruptors. So disruptors are there to change the institution. They're there to change the machinery of this thing that perpetuates dominant ideologies. Our disruptors are looking to expose themselves as being an explicit and it takes courage to constantly be in this juxtaposition with the dominant culture of your environment. Oh, I'm seeing that there's sound.
So, Michelle, every once in a while your sound cuts out, but now there are no slides on the screen.
Okay, yeah, the slides are done now.
Okay, great.
Okay. So again, to our disruptors. So it takes courage to constantly be challenging the system. And so when we speak to disruption, we're looking at things like decolonizing theory. Work with Frantz Fanon, who talks about consciousness changing during collective struggles. And so the work of the disruptor is the work of equity. And so we're probably all familiar with that, the equality versus equity diagram of the three children peering over the fence. And the vision of equity is that, one child is able to see, whereas another child is able to see when standing on one box. And, a third child has a number of boxes. But the disruptor is saying the problem isn't the number of boxes that each child has. The problem is that we're starting from an uneven surface to begin with. So the solution isn't to add or take away boxes. The solution is to level the field. And when we talk about the current context of policing, the disruptor might be the person who's talking about abolishing the police. When we look within the context of our school communities, a disruptor might be that child who's constantly demonstrating behavior We all know the one, probably a face or a name came to mind immediately. So those are our disruptors. Next come our infiltrators. So the function of the infiltrators is to change the institutions by making situational adjustments. In order to be an infiltrator, this requires a certain level of creativity, as you're constantly calculating your approach. So being a part of the system, yet being apart from the system, learning when to push and learning when to pull back. And so the work of critical theories, based on people like Michel Foucault, who talks about microphysics of power. And this is that idea where power is a strategy that anyone can use to disrupt a system or institution. The work of our infiltrators is the work of inclusion, or creating space for all people to to participate in meaningful ways. When we look at the current context of the conversation around policing, these might be the people who are talking about defunding police, reducing the amount of funding for police and increasing the amount of funding for things like education, mental health initiatives, poverty, etc. Within the context of our schools, our infiltrators are probably that colleague who joins the professional development committee and always is suggesting subtly, either speakers or authors, that just members of non-dominant groups. And so this is their way of the dominant narrative within the institution. And finally, we have our survivors. Now, these are the people who adjust to the situation, often appearing to be passive or indifferent to what infiltrators or disruptors might call injustices. And so to be a survivor requires a level of consistency, as you're continuing to exist in an environment that largely was not created for you. And so if we're thinking about survivors, this might be more neoliberal theory that focuses on the individual. When we take this in the context of the conversations on policing, this could be the conversations about a few bad apples. If we could just put in a few more police officers from those communities and remove those bad apples, it will be improved. But I want to challenge our perception, particularly of the survivors in this moment, and use the work of James Scott, who talks about weapons of weakness, everyday forms of resistance. Scott talks about either the means of resistance appear to challenge the status quo. Scott talks about what he calls infrapolitics, and these are ways of mobilizing the movement. And so this is the work of diversity. Who is present? Who is there or not there? And so an example of this would be the parent community that we as an institution might look to and say, oh, these parents are disengaged. They never show up for parent-teacher conference. Yet we ignore the fact that these are parents belonging perhaps to historically disenfranchised groups who have never found a space or a place of belonging within the school system. So each of these identities, the disruptor, the infiltrator, and the survivor, can be either active or they can be passive. They can be passive disruptors who align maybe more closely with active infiltrators. And I use parts of my own historical legacy to kind of demonstrate this. So when we think about disruption, a more active form of disruption might be my history, my legacy, my ancestors who were part of the Haitian Revolution. And so here this revolution was a bloody revolution where it was an overthrowing of the colonizers and a taking back of the island, a taking of the island. Where a more passive form of disruption, looking at my Mennonite heritage, might be the way Mennonites were conscientious objectors to war and didn't actively participate in war efforts. And that lack of people power was another way of undermining the war efforts. So I say all of this to say that all of these forms of resistance are valid, and all of these forms of resistance are essential in creating conditions for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And these are the three characteristics of what would create a more just system of education. And so why do we struggle with these? And I'm catching glimpses of the chats, and with full expectation, people are weighing in and agreeing or disagreeing with the model that I've proposed. And so what I propose further to this model is that part of the tension that exists in our interaction with or understanding of the other comes from what we could call an epistemic gap, or a gap in knowledge or understanding. And so not understanding the validity of these different ways of being and different ways of seeing, not looking to them for a source of inspiration or learning. We look at them as a point of tension or difference. And so as educators, we are confronted by our students, by our colleagues, by caregivers, by leadership from our district, who approach education or their role within institutions in ways that might differ from our own. And so oftentimes these gaps in understanding or these gaps in knowledge explain why people choose to stay in one space as opposed to in another. And so the survivor might be the survivor because they don't understand that they have voice and agency. The infiltrator might be the infiltrator because they don't understand what mechanisms they can use to disrupt the system more fully. And the disruptor might stay in that place because institution and how they might possibly be able to work within it. So that's one possibility. But further again, so what, now what? What is our role as educators? So I want to start by addressing the role of BIPOC educators and other minoritized educators. So first of all, our role is to be disruptors, to take up space. James Baldwin talks about the place in which I fit does not exist, and therefore I will make it. And so that's one way that BIPOC educators can engage in the work of disruption. Secondly, we can be infiltrators by strengthening our networks. This means by involving and inviting in our communities. So educators, from racialized groups, you belong to that group. So taking a moment to interact and work with your community so that allyship between underrepresented groups is another way that we can strengthen our networks and infiltrate. And so this can be working, not looking solely for myself as someone who's Black, looking at that identity, but also looking at other identities. And I think in the chat, I saw the word intersectionality pop up. And finally, the notion of self-care is a third thing that we can practice as BIPOC educators, and that is the notion of survival. And Audre Lorde talks about caring for myself, not as a self-indulgence, but as an act of self-preservation, and that itself is an act of political warfare. So those are three of the roles that, that BIPOC and other minoritized educators can play in creating more just spaces within our school systems. Next, what is the role of white educators? So many minoritized people are existing within that, in that survival space. And so that space of survival is one that we inhabit when we are perhaps the only within an institution. And so as a result, the role of an ally be more than just an understanding, empathetic individual. But Carlos Moreno of Big Picture Learning talks about the need to be accomplices. So take on some of the risk, draw some of that fire, if you will. And so I call upon white educators to be infiltrators and disruptors to the status quo within the school system. So ways that this can be done, first would be in decentering whiteness. And so I look at the example, a personal example of Robin DiAngelo. And so right now, Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is one that a lot of people are sharing. But if you consider her and as she stood there in front of a wide audience, she talked about her identity and how her identity as a white woman meant that oftentimes in conversations about white privilege, people were more inclined to listen to her than they may be to listen to someone from a racialized group. And so what Robin did in this speech is she named that. And she went further by identifying that there are members of the racialized community in Winnipeg. She mentioned that there are members of racialized community in Winnipeg who were doing that same work. And she provided legitimacy to my work by naming me as one of those individuals. And so using your privilege to extend legitimacy, but also questioning why within our institutions do we even need to do that? That's one way of decentering whiteness. So as educators, we can read Robin DiAngelo, but we can also look at reading other authors who, like Ijoma Olu. And this is another book. If you've read Robin DiAngelo, go further with that by reading a Black author. So as educators, we can read, we can cite, we can nominate, we can encourage, we can mentor, we can hire, we can follow BIPOC and other marginalized educators. Learn from experiences as our dominant narrative. Second thing that we can do is we can address microaggressions. And this means not just addressing overt racism, but the subvert forms of racism or that we might see in others. I think about a Canadian scholar, Vijay Ramjatan, who talks about accentism. So what is our approach when we're dealing with community members or staff members who speak English as an additional language? And so is our response that we're referring to that as broken English? Or we recognize the fact that this is a multilingual individual who is calling upon their knowledge of a second language that might have different structures and patterns and order of speech? And are we looking at that as a strength or as an area of weakness? Third way that white educators can approach their role towards justice in education is confronting their white privilege. And so Rachel Cargill talks about unlearning. I'm seeing a lot of other great book suggestions popping up in the chat. And so we need to recognize that we all have and lack certain privileges. But when we're talking about white privilege, we're not talking about you as an individual. We're talking about systemic advantages that exist. We also have to confront our role as a system. So there's the individual level on which we can work, but also there's on the systemic role addressing injustice in education. We are all out of the school system. And so while the system might be a source of power or hegemonic power, as Antonio Gramsci talks about, we are also actors of power, and we can enact it in different ways, both passively and actively in every decision we make. And with our covert or overt curriculum in schools, when we engage with our students, their families, when we engage with colleagues, when we engage with the leadership of our division, these are all opportunities to engage in conversations about equity and justice in education. And so those of you who are working at more divisional level, consider the policies around equity, diversity, and inclusion of your school district. Are they robust? Are they clear? Do engage those communities that we're addressing in their development and in their enactment? Who are we hiring? Sarah Ahmed talks about beyond the diversity worker. I know with the current conversations about anti-Black racism, there's a push for organizations to suddenly hire equity workers. But are we hiring one person, or are we expecting everyone within our institutions to be equity, diversity, and inclusion workers? It's not realistic to put all of that workload on one individual if we actually truly want to change our system. So it has to be an expectation of all who work within our systems. And finally, are we allowing for discomfort? And so we need to expect discomfort. We need to provoke discomfort even by learning the language of anti-racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and we can't treat those words as though they are as negative as those ideas themselves. Because if we're not uncomfortable in our conversations about these things, if we're not, engaging in that first, the fourth agreement from Glenn Singleton in expecting and accepting a lack of closure, but also the third of engaging in discomfort, where is growth going to occur? So those are all kind of broad examples. And I wish this was a different setting because I think there's such rich conversation happening in the chat right now. So I'd like to hand it over to Tanya and perhaps open it up for some questions and some dialogue.
Thank you, Michelle. I note that there are several in the question and answer section, so I'm going to present them to you. I think I do want to start with one that was presented later, and the question is asked, what is the source for the 3 modes of social resistance?
So the source of 3 modes of social resistance is something that I've developed myself. And, you know, as I mentioned, it's from my own personal experiences. And so it's something that, you know, for over a decade I've been talking about, and just more recently have been, you know, trying to pair it with some scholarship. And so I think some of the works that I mentioned, some of the theorists that I mentioned in other ways explain that, but the spectrum on itself and the 3 titles is something that I developed myself.
Thank you. Another question, is there any literature on land acknowledgement?
Yes, I would say if you simply Google any of the school districts in Canada, like Google under Google Scholar Land Acknowledgement, and you'll see some of the research around that. Different school boards and universities across Canada have done additional work in this area, as have a lot of that comes from the calls to action that were developed through the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. And so that would be a great place to start, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. And that was part of a long-term initiative where the stories of residential school survivors were gathered, and through the gathering of those stories and other initiatives, recommendations were made in terms of ways that different groups, including schools, can approach the work of truth and reconciliation.
Yet another question, can you say a bit more about your racial identity as a Black woman? In other words, did you ever consider yourself as mixed race? Why or why not?
That is a good question. So I would say in terms of my identity, I have no denial, no qualms with my mixed race heritage. I'm very involved in both sides of my heritage and very connected with both pieces of that. But when I think about, and that was something that I developed in part
Michelle, I apologize for interrupting. You cut out for just a few seconds again.
Oh, sorry about that. I think in part it's based on how I'm seen. I've never been in a situation where my identity as a Black woman has been questioned, but I have most often been in the situation where my identity as a Russian Mennonite of German descent has been not just questioned, denied. Quite aggressively in some instances. And so I think that those are experiences that contributed to my identity development. And my identification as a Black woman does not mean that I am denying any other part of my identity. I think when, you know, like with anything else, like with my model, Black identity also exists on a spectrum. There's not one way to be Black. And so all of my heritage, regardless of where it comes from, feeds into to that identity.
Thank you. Yet another question says, I'm interested in learning more about how to engage parents who feel disenfranchised in the school system. Examples, parent-teacher meetings, open houses, IEP meetings. Do you have some advice to offer on that?
I would say, I mean, for me, that's a long-term game, and a lot of that is based on relationship. But I think we thinking about how we approach those things. I mean, we often call those types of meetings, you know, the IEP meetings, for instance, the $1 million meeting. And so we invite families to come into the school, and then we have, you know, perhaps one parent and they are there sitting in a room with 12 experts or educators. And I just think about that, the physical structure of those meetings, and how that in itself is disengaging. And so starting with the question when we're inviting parents in for a meeting, is there someone that you would like to bring with you? Perhaps they're not aware of the fact that they can bring a community advocate, making sure that there's a pre-existing relationship as much as possible. And I think being clear on what our intention is in having those meetings. If really what we're doing is looking for the best interest of our students, then approaching that in different ways. And so I think oftentimes we want to resolve things in a systemic way because we are a system. And so we don't pay attention to the way where relationship also needs to feed into that. And so, okay, I want to make my open house more inclusive, so I'm going to have a meeting, but none of those parents are coming, right? As opposed to, I'm going to continue reaching out to those parents and develop a relationship. And once the relationship is there, perhaps get some feedback on how I can adjust things. I think oftentimes in schools, we do things because we've always done them that way. And so one exercise that it came from an indigenous scholar, Kevin Amador. He talked about, thinking about some of our practices as a school and asking ourselves, how does this contribute to equity and how does this take away from equity? And I, in my experience, things like the Scholastic book sale and engaging in a conversation with my school community around a practice that we have always done, just because we've always done it, we actually changed the way that we did something like Scholastic's book fair to try to make it more equitable, but also recognizing that there are always more ways, and so we've never
Michelle, I think
Michelle,
we lost the tail end of your answer. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. We lost the tail end of your answer.
Okay. So just again saying, the work of becoming more equitable is ongoing work. And so I think when we stop questioning and we stop evolving is when we stop doing the work. So never feeling as though we've arrived.
I'm going to acknowledge that there are many questions that are being presented, and I will try and get as many of them to you as possible. As a follow-up to that, I would ask, would you think a letter to parents would be a good first step in informing parents that the classroom is a place where students feel safe to discuss their concerns and opinions on topics, and to bring parents into that space as well?
I think when we're looking at engaging in those things, being knowledgeable about what the policies of your district and what the expectations of your individual school are a good starting place. Not that, you might choose to be the disruptor to go against that, which is also a place that is a valid place to exist within. But I think for myself, I try to center those conversations on the curriculum and on the policies of my district. And so whereas someone might see them as bolder or broader interpretations, really rooting myself in that. And so, one example would be in our school, thinking about, do we send a letter when we are doing things that are from the dominant perspective? We don't, we just do them. So we're always teaching from a perspective. So we don't ask permission to teach from a dominant white Eurocentric perspective. So why are we asking permission to teach from other perspectives? So that's something that that I would invite you to consider. And even just the framing of something as a controversial issue. Why is it controversial? Is it controversial because, again, it goes against what the dominant values are? So, in my work, I think about who are the students in front of me as a school leader, and what are the ways that we are helping our students see themselves in the work that we do on a daily basis. And so, again, centering it on that third curriculum or of divisional district policy is one way that I encourage and I go about doing this work.
Another question asks, what advice would you give to educators who work where a majority of the educators and system is highly centered around whiteness? What tangible strategies can begin the conversation and work necessary to adequately instruct the majority children of color that they teach and serve?
My advice would be figure out who you are. Are you a disruptor? Are you an infiltrator? Are you a survivor in those settings? And honor yourself in the work that you do. Have grace with yourself. I mean, if you are someone who you are the only racialized teacher in what might be a hostile environment, you might not be taking the same risks as you would if you're someone working in a richly diverse environment where that kind of work is encouraged. So I think the first thing is to identify, what works for you, because there are different moments where you might move from one of these identities into another. So I think consider for yourself which fits for you. Do you want to constantly be working in juxtaposition with your colleagues? Maybe that's the choice that you're making. Would you prefer to be someone who, finds that ally or two on staff and uses that relationship to try to further the work, and perhaps it's focusing on the work in your classrooms and starting with those two allies and then allowing that work to grow. So I would say there's not a one answer to that question, because even as teachers, the way we teach needs to be authentic to our identities. And I think that's something that comes with time and with practice.
As I'm preparing to ask the next question, I've noticed that Peggy has come on video, and I want to acknowledge her. If you have a question, Peggy, did you want to ask that now?
No, I prefer, let's get all the participant questions answered.
Okay. And I will acknowledge we probably will not answer all of those in these next few minutes. Michelle, the next was, how can we encourage willingness to be uncomfortable in order to achieve equity and social justice?
I think for myself as a school leader, the way that I encourage is small, subtle ways that I model it is by creating opportunities for my students who might speak languages other than French and English to teach me, right? And so if I, the school principal, am standing in front of an assembly, fumbling through my Punjabi introduction, I'm modeling that risk-taking and that discomfort, and I'm demonstrating that that discomfort is not a negative thing, but a place for growth. So I think that is, that's for me kind of one of the primary ways of doing that when working with colleagues. And one of the things that I recognize is I, as school principal, hold positional authority. And so whether people agree with me or not, I'm not necessarily going to get the same pushback or feedback that I would have when I was a classroom teacher. And so my approach, given my formal and informal place in the hierarchy of schools, is going to also adjust that. So, as a classroom teacher, as a first-year classroom teacher, my approach to things might have been very different as compared to once I've been in the school for quite some time. And so I would say, again, recognizing your identity as an educator and leading from that place and building on your relationships. One of the things I do, and it's uncomfortable conversations, but I have colleagues who are principals in other schools who, are people I consider personal friends. And so I've brought this into the conversation, whereas once upon a time it might have been, okay, well, here we are, kind of complaining about this initiative or lack of this thing. Regardless of just complaining now, I'm now asking my colleagues, well, did you speak up? well, what did you say? Right? And so provoking them and prompting them in that way, but then also making sure that that pressure is coming with support as well. Would you like to talk through it with me? Or here's what I've done in that situation. A lot of work as educators, so this is no different than that.
I think you've alluded to the answer to this next question. It's asked, as an immigrant educator whose cultural experiences may be different, would you recommend the same strategies as white educators or people of color? Acknowledging that the educator came here as an adult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, yes, I think I did allude to it in that, your identity as an educator, your relationships within the district are all things that are going to influence the way that you choose to go about your work. So I think, your identity as an internationally educated teacher or your identity as a newcomer, is neither a positive or a negative, right? It is who you are. And so bringing that to your work, it's not something that you can separate from it, but I wouldn't say, oh, you're a newcomer, therefore you should just be. And the work that I do with internationally educated teachers, part of what we talk about is what are the systemic barriers that they might face and what are their options for responding to them, not promoting one or the other. I give you the example of, there's a teacher that I worked with, and I initially met this teacher when they were an itinerant, a substitute teacher, and they presented themselves to me giving one name. And so later on, I met them in another school and they were using a different name. So we engaged in a conversation about this, and they had said, well, it was suggested to me that my name was too difficult and I should choose an easier one. So that's why I'm going by this name now. And so my response was, well, what name do you want to be called? Right? And so it wasn't for me to say, well, I don't feel as though it was for me to say, well, no, this is the name you should use, right? And this person might have said, I really hate hearing people mispronounce my name on a daily basis, and it's quite aggravating and frustrating to me, and that's a microaggression that I'm having a hard time dealing with, and so I'm choosing to use a different name. Or this individual might have said, you know what, no, this is my name, and people need to learn to use it, so I'm going to teach them and need your support in that. And so for me, again, it wasn't a question of me making the decision for that individual, but letting the individual know that there's some voice and agency in that, and that they can make the decision for themselves, and they get to choose the name that they're using.
The next question is, why do you think that Indigenous educators or scholars are often absent from panels or conferences, especially in the North American context?
I think because our system is, based on, our education systems are based on Eurocentric values. And so when we start bringing in other voices, it creates discomfort. It challenges our way of being. And I think it's Talib Kweli who talks about, when you're accustomed to privilege, equity feels like oppression. And so for educators from the dominant group, or even for myself as a racialized educator who is in a position of power and authority within the school system, am I ready to give up some of my space to create space for others? And so when we bring in voices that are contrary to the dominant narrative, it means that we might need to look internally and say, oh, I'm doing this wrong, or I'm not as liberal, or I'm not as inclusive, or I'm not as equitable as I strive to be. And I think that's something that we need to own, and our response to those things is important. So, for myself personally, I think of an experience with a parent who happens to be from the Indigenous community, who based on previous experiences came in to meet with me very angry about a situation, and immediately the conversation went to, calling lawyers and calling the district and suing me and getting my job and this and that. I had a choice to make in that moment. I could have reacted with defensiveness, or I could have reacted with openness. And I chose to react with openness and acknowledge the experience that that individual was bringing, and acknowledge that I, as a school leader, had an opportunity to do better, and I wanted to do better. And that changed the dynamic between this parent and myself for the positive. So I think when we're looking at the absence of Indigenous voice in conversations about education, I think a lot of that is we're willing to do diversity. So let's put in a few places, let's do a land acknowledgement, but let's not actually fundamentally challenge the structure and the purpose of the system.
I'm going to note that I thought we had time for more, but we are at time. We do have many questions that remain. However, at this time, I just want to thank you. It was an incredible session. Thank you so much for your reflections, for your thoughts, for the work that you're doing and are doing. I will acknowledge that there have been some questions asking where people can learn more about you. I know that you said that you are on Twitter and invited people to follow you there, but perhaps there will be an opportunity for us to share additional information about you as information is shared from this session. Thank you again. With that, I will pass back to Peggy.
Thank you so much. And what I would like to do is to invite you to another core webinar series that we have just to continue this conversation. So rich. So thank you from all of us.
Thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure to be here.